The late afternoon sun of September 20th, 1863, struggled to penetrate the suffocating canopy of the North Georgia woodlands, the light fractured by the acrid haze of black powder that hung stagnant in the humid air. This was the banks of the Chickamauga, a Cherokee word often translated as River of Death, a name that was earning its grim literalism with every passing hour. The ground, parched by a long summer drought, had been churned into a fine, choking dust by the trampling of thousands of iron-shod hooves and the boots of desperate infantrymen. It coated the uniforms of the men of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, turning their Confederate gray into the neutral earthen brown of the forest floor, masking individual identities in the collective anonymity of war. Sergeant Richard Rowland Kirkland stood amidst the tangled underbrush at the base of a steep, wooded incline known to history as Snodgrass Hill, or Horseshoe Ridge. At 20 years old, he was a veteran of the Army of Northern Virginia, a survivor of the meat grinder battles in the East, Manassas, Savage's Station, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. He and his comrades in Kershaw's brigade had arrived in the Western Theater only recently, transported over hundreds of miles of rickety rails to reinforce General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee. They brought with them the hard-bitten confidence of Robert E. Lee's shock troops, but the chaotic, sprawling brawl of these Georgia woods was a different beast entirely from the open fields of Virginia. The battle had been raging for 2 days. Earlier that morning, a fatal miscommunication in the Union command had opened a massive gap in the Federal lines, and General James Longstreet, commanding the Confederate left wing, had driven his columns through it like a sledgehammer. The Union right had collapsed, sending thousands of blue-clad soldiers and their commanding general, William Rosecrans, fleeing back toward Chattanooga in a panicked rout. It seemed as though the entire Union Army of the Cumberland was on the brink of annihilation. But the victory was not yet secured. On this ridge, Major General George H. Thomas had rallied the remnants of the Union Army. Fragments of broken regiments, stragglers, and defiant brigades had coalesced around him, forming a desperate, horseshoe-shaped defensive line. Thomas, a Virginian loyal to the Union, was earning the moniker the Rock of Chickamauga in real time, holding the high ground with a stubbornness that defied military logic. If the Confederates could not dislodge him before nightfall, the Union Army would escape destruction. Kirkland checked his Enfield rifle, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The 2nd South Carolina, part of Joseph Kershaw's brigade, was positioned on the Confederate left, near the Viteto House. The terrain before them was a nightmare for an attacking force, a series of steep ravines and ridges choked with scrub, oak and briars, offering perfect cover for the defenders and none for the attackers. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the sulphurous stench of spent ammunition. The order was filtering down the line. Take the ridge. It was a suicide mission in any other context, a frontal assault against a fortified enemy holding the high ground. But the blood of the regiment was up. They had seen the enemy running earlier in the day. They smelled the final victory. Kirkland looked at the faces of the men in his company, boys he had grown up with in Kershaw County, men who had marched with him since the heady days of 1861. They were gaunt, their uniforms tattered, their eyes hollowed by the fatigue of the long journey and the brutal fighting, but they were ready. To their front, the sounds of the battle were changing. The rhythmic popping of musketry was being replaced by a continuous, rolling roar, a sound that indicated a volume of fire unusual even for this war. The defenders on the ridge were not just desperate, they were heavily armed. Reports had filtered back that some of the Union regiments on the crest were equipped with repeating rifles, weapons that could fire multiple rounds without reloading, pouring a stream of lead that no muzzle loader could match. Kirkland tightened his grip on his weapon, the Angel of Mary's Heights. The man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death to bring water to his enemies was now required to be the warrior once more. The duality of his existence, the compassionate humanitarian and the ruthless soldier, was about to collide on the slopes of Snodgrass Hill. The signal came. The officers drew their swords. The rebel yell, a terrifying high-pitched shriek, rose from the throats of the South Carolinians, piercing the roar of the guns. They stepped off, moving out of the tree line and into the maelstrom. As the 2nd South Carolina began their ascent into the teeth of the Union defense, the timeline of history seemed to bend, the sheer violence of the moment anchoring them to the bloody soil of Georgia. The assault on Snodgrass Hill was not a maneuver of elegance, it was a collision of brute force. As the 2nd South Carolina surged forward, the topography immediately began to fracture their formations. The ravines funneled the men into narrow killing zones, bunching them together and making them prime targets for the Union marksmen entrenched on the crest. The slope was steep, slick with pine needles and loose dirt, forcing the men to scramble on hands and knees, clawing at roots to pull themselves upward into the hail of lead. Sergeant Richard Kirkland moved at the head of his company, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Forward! Keep moving! Don't bunch up!" The air around him hissed and snapped with the passage of thousands of bullets. Leaves and twigs, severed by the fire, rained down on them like a gentle autumn fall, a grotesque contrast to the violence that caused it. The enemy they faced was the 21st Ohio Infantry, a regiment that possessed a terrifying technological advantage, the 5-shot Colt revolving rifle. Unlike the standard single-shot muskets that required a soldier to stop, bite a cartridge, ram it down the barrel, and cap the weapon, a process that took 20 seconds for even a skilled soldier, the Ohioans could unleash 5 rounds in quick succession. The volume of fire coming from the ridge was relentless, a continuous sheet of flame that shredded the underbrush and the men advancing through it. Men to Kirkland's left and right spun and fell, their bodies tumbling back down the steep incline. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that hammered against the eardrums. The rebel yell had disintegrated into a cacophony of individual screams of rage and pain. The smoke from the black powder settled in the low ground, creating a dense, artificial fog that obscured the enemy, leaving only the flashing muzzles visible as angry red stabs of light in the gloom. Kirkland scrambled over a fallen log, his eyes fixed on the crest. He could see the blue uniforms now, the grim faces of the Union soldiers as they worked the actions of their revolving rifles. The distance was closing, 60 yards, 50 yards. The 2nd South Carolina was taking horrific casualties, but the momentum of the charge carried them forward. They were driven by a collective will, a refusal to turn back after coming so far. The regiment was drifting to the left, pulled by the terrain and the intensity of the fire. They were moving toward a sector of the line held by Brannan's division, arguably the strongest point of the Union defense. The fire here was not just from the 21st Ohio. Elements of other broken units had rallied, adding their single-shot muskets to the repeating fire of the Colts. It was a wall of lead. Kirkland paused for a fraction of a second behind the trunk of a large oak tree to check the line. His chest heaved, his uniform soaked with sweat and grime. He looked back and saw his men wavering. The sheer intensity of the fire had pinned them down. They were seeking cover behind rocks and in the folds of the earth. The charge was stalling. If they stayed here, they would be picked apart. If they retreated, they would be shot in the back. There was only one way to survive: to close with the enemy, to get under the guns and engage in hand-to-hand combat. He stepped out from behind the tree. In that frozen second, Richard Kirkland became a target for hundreds of rifles. He waved his hat, his sword, whatever was in his hand, urging his men forward. "Come on, boys, one more push." He was a figure of defiance, a gray silhouette against the smoke. The Union defenders, seeing the leader, shifted their aim. The air around him seemed to boil with the passage of bullets. He took a step, then another. He was leading them into the fire, just as he had led them to water 9 months earlier. But this time, there was no truce. There was no mercy. There was only the cold mechanics of ballistics and the unforgiving geometry of the kill zone. Kirkland planted his foot to climb a rocky outcrop, his eyes locking with the enemy line above. The roar of the 21st Ohio's rifles reached a crescendo, and there, amidst the smoke and the scream of the dying, we leave Richard Kirkland suspended in time, a warrior at the apex of his charge, facing the fires of hell on a Georgia hilltop. We must travel back 9 months, to December 1862. The war had moved to the colonial town of Fredericksburg, situated on the banks of the Rappahannock River. The Army of the Potomac, now under the command of Major General Ambrose Burnside, had massed over 120,000 men to strike a blow against the Confederate capital of Richmond. Standing in their way was General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, dug in on the high ground west of the town. The weather was a vicious enemy in its own right. It was the Little Ice Age, and the winter of 1862 was bitterly cold. The ground was frozen hard as iron. The mud formed into jagged ruts that tore at the boots of the marching men. A biting wind swept across the river valley, cutting through the thin wool uniforms of the Confederate defenders. Among them was Richard Kirkland, then a 19-year-old sergeant in the 2nd South Carolina. Kirkland and his unit were deployed in a position that military engineers dream of: a sunken road. Telegraph Road, running along the base of Marye's Heights, had been worn down by years of wagon traffic until it sat several feet below the surrounding terrain. Bordering the road on the side facing the town was a 4-foot-high stone wall. This combination created a natural trench. A soldier standing in the road was completely protected from the waist down, able to load his rifle in safety, step up to the wall to fire, and duck back down. Behind them, artillery massed on the heights could fire over their heads, sweeping the plain below. On the morning of December 13th, a dense fog lifted to reveal the Union Army arrayed for battle. Burnside, under immense political pressure to deliver a victory, ordered a series of frontal assaults against the impregnable Confederate position. It was a decision that would result in one of the greatest tragedies of the war. From his position behind the wall, Kirkland watched as the blue lines emerged from the town. They had to cross a canal ditch, reform their lines, and then march across 400 yards of open, muddy ground that sloped gently upward toward the stone wall. It was a killing field, devoid of cover, perfectly sighted by the Confederate guns. As the Union troops advanced, the artillery on Marye's Heights opened fire, tearing great gaps in their formations. But the Federal soldiers closed ranks and kept coming, their bravery undeniable. When they reached within 100 yards, the infantry behind the stone wall unleashed a volley. The sunken road erupted in a continuous sheet of flame. The 2nd South Carolina, standing 4 ranks deep, maintained a rotating fire, front rank firing, stepping back to reload, rear rank stepping forward. It was a relentless machine of destruction. Wave after wave of Union troops were fed into the grinder. The Irish Brigade, with their green flags snapping in the wind, charged with a reckless courage that elicited gasps of admiration, even from the Confederates killing them. They melted, blown away under the fire. Then came the divisions of French, Hancock, and Howard. The field turned into a carpet of blue bodies. Late in the day, the division of George Sykes, the regulars, professional soldiers of the U.S. Army, was thrown into the fight. The 17th U.S. Infantry, displaying iron discipline, managed to advance closer than most, getting within 80 yards of the wall. But they, too, were stopped. Pinned down by the withering fire, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat, they threw themselves flat into the freezing mud, using the bodies of their fallen comrades as shields. Kirkland fired until his shoulder was bruised black and blue from the recoil of his Enfield, his face blackened with powder soot. He watched as the sun went down, casting long shadows over a field that was literally moving with the agony of thousands of wounded men. The shooting tapered off as darkness fell, but the horror was only beginning. Night fell over Fredericksburg, but it brought no peace. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud into a jagged, bloody crust. The wounded men, numbering in the thousands, lay scattered across the open plain between the town and the stone wall. They were trapped in a no-man's land, unable to crawl back to their own lines without drawing fire from the nervous sentries, and unable to reach the Confederate lines. Then, a phenomenon occurred that stamped the night with a surreal, haunting quality. The sky above the battlefield began to shimmer. Great curtains of light, red, green, and white, danced across the northern horizon. It was the aurora borealis, the northern lights, a rare spectacle for this latitude. To the Confederates, flushed with victory, it might have seemed a celestial celebration. But to the men dying in the freezing dark, it must have looked like the gates of heaven, or hell, swinging open. Under the eerie glow of the aurora, a sound began to rise from the field. It started as a low murmur, a collective groan of pain, and grew steadily into a wailing chorus that drowned out the wind. It was the sound of extreme thirst. The massive blood loss suffered by the wounded caused a burning, unquenchable dehydration. "Water! Water! Please, water!" The cry was relentless. It penetrated the stone wall and the hearts of the men hunkered down in the sunken road. Sergeant Kirkland sat with his back against the cold stones, trying to sleep, but the sound made it impossible. These were the men he had spent the day trying to kill, the enemy who had invaded his country. But in the dark, stripped of their uniforms and flags, they were just men, sons, brothers, fathers, dying in agony. The 17th U.S. Infantry and other units of the regulars were still pinned down out there, freezing to death in the open. Every cry was a reminder of the shared humanity that war tries so hard to obliterate. The psychological toll on the defenders was immense. They were safe, warm, and had water, while yards away, a sea of misery surged against their conscience. Kirkland listened to the specific timbre of the voices. Some were screaming in delirium. Others were moaning softly. He could hear the distinct calls for mothers, for wives, for God. The murderous skirmish fire continued sporadically throughout the night and into the next morning, preventing any organized relief efforts. The Union commanders requested a truce to gather their wounded, but the communications were slow and the guns remained loaded. As the sun rose on December 14th, the scene was revealed in all its ghastly detail. The bodies were stiff, frozen in the contorted shapes of their final moments. But amongst the piles of dead, hundreds were still alive, waving feeble hands, pointing to their parched mouths. The chorus of "water" had not ceased. It had only grown more desperate with the rising sun. Kirkland watched through a gap in the stones. He saw a man try to drag himself toward the wall, only to collapse. He saw another trying to drink from a frozen puddle of bloody mud. Something inside the young sergeant broke, or perhaps something was repaired. The hardening of the soldier's heart cracked, and the man underneath emerged. It was mid-morning on December 14th when Sergeant Richard Kirkland abruptly stood up in the sunken road. His face was pale, his jaw set with a determination that had nothing to do with combat. He gathered up a collection of empty canteens from his messmates and marched toward the Stevens house, a large residence near the wall that served as the headquarters for General Joseph Kershaw. He found the general surveying the carnage. Kirkland, a mere sergeant, approached the brigade commander with a breach of protocol driven by emotional necessity. He saluted, his voice trembling not with fear, but with emotion. "General, I can't stand this," Kirkland said. Kershaw, a stern, battle-hardened officer, looked at the young man with confusion. "What is the matter, Sergeant?" "All night and all day I have heard those poor people crying for water, and I can stand it no longer," Kirkland replied, gesturing toward the field of death. "I come to ask permission to go and give them water." Kershaw stared at him. He looked over the wall, where Union sharpshooters were still active, picking off anyone who showed themselves. "Kirkland, don't you know that you would get a bullet through your head the moment you stepped over the wall?" "Yes, sir," Kirkland answered softly. "I know that. But if you will let me, I am willing to try it." The general hesitated. He was responsible for the lives of his men, and Kirkland was a valuable non-commissioned officer. Yet the nobility of the request was undeniable. It cut through the cynicism of the command tent. "Kirkland," Kershaw said, his voice softening, "I ought not to allow you to do it, but the sentiment which actuates you is so noble that I will not refuse your request." He paused, then added, "May fortune favor you." Kirkland's eyes brightened. "Thank you, sir." But then came the caveat. Kirkland asked for a white handkerchief to use as a flag of truce. Kershaw shook his head. He had no authority to initiate a formal truce, and showing a white flag might be misinterpreted as a surrender or weakness. "No, Kirkland, you can have no white flag," Kershaw said. "I cannot allow that." Kirkland did not blink. "All right, sir," he said. "I'll take my chances." He returned to the well near the house, filling the canteens until they were heavy with water. He draped them over his shoulders, a clumsy burden of mercy. Then, without a word to his comrades, he climbed over the stone wall. As his gray uniform appeared above the parapet, a ripple of movement went through the Union lines. Hundreds of rifles leveled at him. The soldiers of the 17th U.S. Infantry, lying prone in the mud, thought he was a scavenger, a ghoul coming to rob the dead of boots and watches. Fingers tightened on triggers. Kirkland did not run. He did not crouch. He walked calmly into the open ground. He approached the nearest wounded soldier, a man from the opposing army, and knelt down. He lifted the man's head, resting it gently against his knee, and held a canteen to his blackened, parched lips. The shock of the moment paralyzed the Union marksman. This was not war. This was something else entirely. A shout rang out from the Federal side. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot him!" Slowly, the rifles were lowered. A profound silence descended over that sector of the battlefield, a silence louder than the cannonade. For the next hour and a half, Richard Kirkland moved through the carnage. He went from man to man, giving water, straightening broken limbs, and placing knapsacks under heads for pillows. He was the only moving thing in a landscape of death. But the history books often leave out a crucial detail. Courage is contagious. As Kirkland continued his work unharmed, another soldier from the 2nd South Carolina, Isaac Rents, watched his friend. Overcoming his own terror, Rents gathered more canteens and climbed over the wall to join him. Together, the two Confederates ferried water to the enemy, working in tandem to relieve the suffering. From the Union lines, a cheer began to rise. It started as a low rumble and grew into a roar. Thousands of men cheering the enemy who was saving their brothers. It was a moment of sublime transcendence, where the Angel of Mary's Heights suspended the war, if only for an hour, proving that even in the midst of slaughter, humanity could not be extinguished. September 20th, 1863, Snodgrass Hill, Georgia. We return now to the precipice. The timeline snaps back to the present, to the smoke-choked slopes of Snodgrass Hill. Richard Kirkland stood exposed on the rocky outcrop, the hero of Fredericksburg, now the target of Chickamauga. The moment of grace he had purchased with water in Virginia held no currency here in the savage woods of Georgia. The 21st Ohio, realizing the threat of the renewed charge led by this gray-clad figure, concentrated their fire. The bullet struck him in the chest with the force of a sledgehammer. It was a solid, sickening impact that knocked the breath from his body and threw him backward onto the pine needles. The Angel collapsed, his rifle slipping from his grasp. The charge of the 2nd South Carolina surged past him, the men screaming in fury as they saw their beloved sergeant fall. They crashed into the Union lines, the battle dissolving into a chaotic melee of bayonets and clubbed muskets. Kirkland lay where he fell, the sounds of the battle receding into a dull roar, like the ocean heard from a distance. The cold that crept into his limbs was not the winter chill of Fredericksburg, but the encroaching shadow of death. He looked up at the canopy of the trees, the sunlight filtering through the smoke. Two of his comrades, seeing him fall, dropped back to help him. They knelt beside him, ignoring the bullets that zipped and hissed around them. They tried to lift him, to drag him to safety, but Kirkland knew. He felt the life draining from him, the fatal lethargy taking hold. He looked at the faces of his friends, Isaac Rentz perhaps among them, or others who had watched him cross the wall that day in December. He shook his head weakly. "I'm done for," he whispered, the blood bubbling on his lips. "Save yourselves." He took a ragged, shallow breath, his eyes losing focus. He thought of his home in Flat Rock, of the quiet fields of Kershaw County, and of his father, John Kirkland. He needed them to know. He needed them to know that he had not faltered, that he had held true to the code of the soldier and the man. "And please," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the din of war, "tell my pa, I died right." To die right. It was the ultimate epitaph of the Civil War soldier. It meant he had faced the fire without flinching. It meant he had done his duty. It meant that the man who had shown the ultimate mercy was also capable of the ultimate sacrifice. Richard Rowland Kirkland died on the slopes of Snodgrass Hill on September 20th, 1863. He was 20 years old. His body was eventually recovered and returned to South Carolina, where he was laid to rest in the old Quaker cemetery in Camden. For years, his story was told only around the fires of veterans, a legend of the angel passed down in hushed tones. It was not until 1880, when General Kershaw published his account, that the world fully recognized the duality of the boy who had killed with efficiency but healed with compassion. In the end, Richard Kirkland remains a complex symbol of the American Civil War. He was a warrior who led a charge into the teeth of repeating rifles, and a humanitarian who walked unarmed into a firing squad to bring water to a dying foe. His life, short and violent, serves as a reminder that even when the world descends into the madness of hatred, the individual retains the power to choose mercy. He died right, not just because he fought well, but because he lived, for one brief, shining hour, as an angel among men.